and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious sides of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and on this episode I'll be telling you the story of Black Jack Adair and the cursing stones of Tory Island. Let's start by talking about Tory Island. It's about 3 miles long, half a mile wide, has a population of 100 or 200 people, and is 9 miles from the coast of Donegal. You can't take a car over on the ferry, though you can take a helicopter back in an emergency. The origin of the name Tory is, like many Irish place names, pretty obscure. The simplest explanation is that it was Ullin Tory, the island of towers, after the rock spires and the water around it. Others have it as Ullin Tory, the island of the King's Tower. Some people even think it might have been Ullin Thor, Thor's island. It was controlled by the Danes at one point. The modern Irish version, Ullin Tory, translates as Island of Pirates. This word is why Tories became the English slang for Irish brigands. That's why the English Conservative Party are called Tories. It was a nickname that started as an insult and became a badge of pride. Like the name, the history of the island is hidden in the mists of time. The oldest Irish history is Labor Gabala Éireann, the Book of the Invasions of Ireland. In this book, the Celts, or Milesians, were the 6th people to come and conquer Ireland. They took it from the Tuatha De Danann, who were elves, gods, or savages, depending on which set of legends you're looking at. Their foes were the Fomorians, strange devilish creatures who, as far as anyone could tell, never actually came to Ireland, but had either always been there or had been conjured up from the land itself. The king of the Fomorians was Balor, of the Evil Eye. Balor was a giant, and had an eye which, when opened, brought destruction to anything he looked at. Whether this was one of his regular eyes, or an eye in the middle of his forehead, or his only eye, varies from tale to tale. Balor ruled the Fomorians from a castle in Tory Island, the Tower of the King. The most famous legend about Balor is that he heard a prophecy that his grandson would kill him, so he locked his daughter Ethniu in a tower to keep her from men. However, when Balor stole a magical cow, the hero who came and stole it back took time out to also sleep with Ethniu. She had triplets, who Balor tried to drown when he found out. One was rescued by the sea god Manannan and went on to become the god hero Lu, who was king of the Tuatha De Danann when they finally defeated the Fomorians. In the final battle, he was the only person unaffected by his grandfather's evil eye, and killed him by hurling a sling stone made of brains and lime into it. The Fomorians might have been based on real pirates, and it would make sense for a pirate king to be based on Tory Island. It was both heavily defensible and gave an ideal position to control the northwestern coast. It was invaded and passed back and forth between different powers, and was even conquered by Scotland at one point. The last major battle on the island took place in 1608, when a group of Irish rebels were besieged by the British. The rebels eventually wound up killing each other. This is because of a rule passed by Sir William Pelham, leader of the English, called Pelham's Pardon. A rebel could only surrender and be spared if he killed another rebel of higher rank. When the defence of Tory Island became hopeless, the defenders turned on each other to earn their pardon. A millennia earlier, the great Saint Columcille came to the island to convert the locals. He stood on the mainland and the waters parted to let him walk to the island. As soon as he arrived, the islanders set a dog on him. Luckily for Columcille, his innate holiness was apparent to the beast, if not to the islanders, and it wouldn't attack. He founded a monastery on the island, the tower of which survives to this day. Columcille is also linked to some of the superstitions of the island. There's a church on the island called Morshahar, the Church of the Seven. The story is that it's the burial site of a group of 7 victims of a shipwreck, either nuns who were buried by Columcille, or 6 men and a woman who were never identified. In the latter version, when the islanders buried the 7 strangers, they found that the woman's body kept rising out of her grave to the surface. They eventually decided that she was neither related to nor married to any of the 6 men, and so objected to being buried with them, so they buried her separately. It's believed that clay from Morshahar has magical properties, and that it can calm down rough seas and drive off rats from a ship. The clay has to be lifted by the eldest member of the Duggan family, who is somewhat of a spiritual leader for the island, and who would lead the Sunday prayers when they didn't have a priest in residence. The other leader of the island is the king, though despite the name he's more of an elected magistrate, by Brehon law the final court of appeal in disputes over lands and salvage. The most recent king of Tory Island was the artist and musician Patsy Dan Rogers, who turned the island into a popular artistic retreat. He died in 2018, and there has been no king of Tory since. There are a lot of other beliefs and superstitions on the island, too many to get into. The main one we want to talk about today is the cursing stones. Cursing stones are not unique to Tory Island. The proper name for them is bullens. A bullen is a round hollow space in a broad flat stone with a large round stone sitting in it. The round stone can be rotated in place, which over time means that the hollow gets worn and smoothed out to fit it, creating a bowl, which is where bullen comes from. They vary greatly in size and are found all over Ireland and Scotland. They may have started as primitive flour mills or something like that, but eventually they became part of local folklore. The idea was that by turning the stone and praying, you could either wish good or evil on someone. Stones were sometimes known as curing stones, but were more often described as cursing stones. The Irish poet Samuel Ferguson mentions them in his epic poem, The Burial of King Cormac. In the poem, King Cormac has decided to support Christianity. The priests of the pagan god Crom Cruach see this as blasphemy. Quote, "They loosed their curse against the king, they cursed him in his flesh and bones, and daily in their mystic ring they turned the maledictive stones." Most of the bullens have lost their stones. Often they were removed by priests, and the bowls were then filled with holy water. The idea still persists that rainwater which collects in the bowls is inherently blessed. Some did remain in place, though. In 1884, James Scone, an Edinburgh naturalist, wrote that he visited Garton in Donegal and met a local woman. She was trying to arrange passage on a boat to Tory Island, where, according to her, there was a stone over which she could say the name of Mr. Adair and he would be dead within a year. The Mr. Adair she was referring to was Black Jack, the most hated man in Ireland. John George Jack Adair was born on the 3rd of March 1823 in Queen's County in Ireland. That county was renamed Laois after Irish independence, for obvious reasons. It was an appropriate home for the Adairs, who were all loyal servants of the crown. The family had been landowners in Ireland since the 16th century. Jack's ancestor, Robert Adair, had been knighted by King William for raising and leading a regiment at the Battle of the Boyne. One of Jack's cousins was a baronet, an MP, and Jack's parents had grand plans for him. He was educated at Trinity College in Dublin, after which he received a post in the British diplomatic service. He was posted to Florence, where he developed a love for the Italian architecture and design that he would keep for his whole life. That wasn't all he developed, however. A British banker living in the city named John Leyland Mackay took Jack under his wing. There is strong evidence to suggest that, unknown to Mackay, Jack repaid him by sleeping with his wife and conceiving a child with her. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he maintained a close link with Mackay and his family, a financial connection that proved to be very useful when he quit his job. Jack had a temper, and that didn't go well with diplomacy. Some sources say that Jack may have spent some time in the military after he left the diplomatic service. It's hard to imagine it suited him any better. It's claimed that he reached the rank of captain, though if he did, he didn't use it in later life. Regardless, he headed to New York sometime in the 1850s, where he found one thing he was really good at: land speculation. His family had money. His father had inherited sugar plantations in the West Indies, for example. Jack proved to be very good at taking money and using it to make more money. Flush with this cash, he headed back to Ireland, where he set up a new branch of his land brokers and started buying up land in Donegal. He combined several smaller holdings to create a single large estate. It was named Glenveigh, after the local name for the general area, which translates as Glen of the Birches. And it was in Donegal in 1861 that Jack would become hated. That was for what became known as the Derry Veigh evictions. Why Adair ordered the evictions is unclear. One story has it that it was simply to improve the view from his castle. This is somewhat undermined by the fact that he wouldn't build that castle until 10 years later. Another story is that Adair took a grudge against his tenants after they reported him for trespassing when he hunted across their lands. But the most likely reason is that Adair had a vision for his estate, and tenants formed no part of it. Instead, he wanted to get into the businesses of hunting and sheep farming. In fact, Jack had already employed 2 men to move the sheep onto his estate, named Rankin and Murray. Murray was a Scot, and frequently argued with the tenant farmers. In November 1860 he went missing, and a few days later his dead body was found at the bottom of a gorge. It was indisputably murder, with signs of a vicious struggle on his body and on the ground above, but the police were never able to find a suspect. Some locals claimed that the murder was carried out by Rankin on Adair's orders, while others claimed that Rankin was having an affair with Murray's wife, and that the two moved in together after Murray's death. This is untrue. She was pregnant when her husband was murdered, and after the child was born she returned to Scotland. The police thought it more likely that he was killed by the tenants, and Rankin was placed under police protection. A series of letters survive where the constables complain about the poor treatment they got. Quote, I spoke to Mr. Adair on the 20th to provide us with fuel and light, which he declined to give us. He has also refused to allow us to cut timber. We have to patrol the mountain during the day and return at night to a damp, cold house, with our clothing wet, ourselves fatigued from cold and want of food, having no fire to cook our victuals or dry our clothing. It was probably his plan all along, but the murder of Murray gave Jack an excuse to get rid of his tenants. This was inspired by similar clearances in the Highlands of Scotland. On St. Patrick's Day, 17th of March 1861, Adair obtained a writ of habeas facias possessionum, a legal document granting him the right to evict his tenants and take back possession of his land. With this in hand, he gathered a group of 203 police officers along with 10 crowbar men and sent them off to execute it. The first house they came to belonged to a widow named MacAward, and there, with the weight of the law behind him, the sheriff evicted her. She and her 7 children were removed from the house, and with them out, the crowbar men made short work of demolishing it. The posse went from house to house, 46 houses in all. All of them were emptied out and 28 were levelled or otherwise made uninhabitable to prevent the tenants from returning. 244 people were left homeless, 47 families, including 159 children. In the end, 42 of the residents wound up in the workhouse, the last resort of the poor and penniless, while over half would emigrate to Australia. Their fares were paid by the Donegal Relief Committee, a charity organised in Sydney by a Donegal migrant named Michael O'Grady. This charity also bought land for them in Australia, and also helped 130 people from poverty-stricken Gweedore join them on the trip to the new land of opportunity. It was one of the most infamous evictions in Irish history, one which made the name of Black Jack Adair forever a curse in the county of Donegal. Jack didn't care. He had romance on his mind. He was courting Cornelia Ritchie, an American widow. She was the daughter of a U.S. general whose brother was a U.S. congressman, solid member of the aristocracy that the Americans say they don't have. She was in Europe, arranging for her 2 sons, James and Arthur, to study there when she met Jack. He was a fiery 46-year-old with a massive black beard. She was an even-tempered 32-year-old, but sparks still flew between them. In 1869, the two were married. First, they split their time between Ireland and New York, where Cornelia had family, but Jack took a dislike to the city. Cornelia's relatives, having heard stories of the wild American frontier, suggested that the two might be happier out west. So Jack and Cornelia Adair set out to establish a brokerage office for his firm in Denver, Colorado. While there, he went out on a hunting trip with a local celebrity as a guide. That was a former Confederate colonel named Charles Goodnight, who 10 years earlier had been involved in a famous gather of feral cattle. He and Oliver Loving led a massive herd that had been living wild across Texas during the Civil War north to Colorado, along what became known as the Goodnight-Loving Trail. Colonel Goodnight then formed a partnership with cattle baron John Chisholm, taking his herds to Colorado to sell to the army. He was between trips when he took Jack and Cornelia out hunting. The trip was a disaster. The only thing Jack killed was his own horse when he dropped his rifle. But Colonel Goodnight found what he'd really been looking for, a partner. The railway was expanding, and Goodnight could see that the days of the great cattle drives were coming to an end. He had founded the first cattle ranch on the southern plains of Texas. He proposed to Adair that the Irishmen provide the capital for Goodnight to expand it out into the unclaimed area known as the Texas Panhandle. Adair was wary and refused to buy land he had not seen. So the two men, along with their intrepid wives, a group of cowboys, and ranching supplies, including several fertile bulls for breeding purposes, set out for Palo Duro Canyon. The trip took 12 days and was not without adventure. A local group of outlaws heard of the Adairs and decided to kidnap them to hold for ransom, even going so far as to build a hideout to hold them. Fortunately, Goodnight heard rumours of what they were up to and persuaded a group of US cavalrymen to act as escort. Adair's temperament, meanwhile, rubbed several of the cowboys the wrong way. On one occasion, when he demanded a horse be saddled for him, the cowboys took care to give him the meanest horse they had. They were then disgusted when, under Adair's control, it became the gentlest horse in the world. In fact, it was only through Goodnight's intervention that Adair did not get attacked by the cowboys. The colonel would later comment that he sometimes regretted not fighting Adair himself. If Black Jack was rubbing people the wrong way, Cornelia was blossoming. She rode the entire distance from Colorado to the ranch, and she was the one who picked out the site for the ranch house. It was her rather than Jack who would in the end be regarded as the true founder of the ranch, as she was the one who would run it for the rest of her life. But it was Jack's name that made up the initials of the JA brand used by the ranch. The deal was Jack provided 2/3 of the capital and owned 2/3 of the ranch, and Goodnight paid and owned the remainder. In addition, they agreed that Goodnight would manage the ranch with an annual salary of $2,500, and Adair would lend him the shortfall in what he needed to make up his share of the investment at 10% interest. It was a good deal for Adair. 15 years later, he had made a profit of $512,000 over his original investment, and that's in 19th century money. With that settled, he returned to Ireland to build a castle in the Glen. Anyone who has visited Glenveigh Castle in Donegal will see Jack Adair did not lack ambition when he built it. His reported inspiration was Balmoral Castle, Scottish retreat of the British royal family, and he intended to outdo them. He planted palatial gardens around it, some in Italian style, inspired by his time in Florence, some in French style, and all with a view of the Glen. He decorated it with sculptures both new and old, including sphinxes, figures of Greek gods, busts in the Tunisian style, and even 2 temple guardians taken from distant Bali. The castle itself had a grandiose old-fashioned exterior, but a thoroughly modern interior. The castle had been finished by 1884, when the woman in Garton sought to curse Jack Adair. It had been over 20 years since the Derryveigh evictions, but some wounds run deep, and Jack had done little to mend relations with his tenants. Whether the woman made her trip or not, if she used the stones, then they turned out to be just as effective as she'd hoped. In 1885, while returning from the JA ranch, Jack Adair died of unknown but natural causes in St. Louis, Missouri. His body was brought back to Ireland and buried in his family graveyard in Ballybritis. Cornelia raised a memorial to him in Glenveigh. The large stone had his name on it, and underneath, "Brave, generous and true." Several years later, the stone was destroyed. Local legend is that it was struck by lightning, though whether lightning had help from men with sledgehammers, I couldn't possibly say. If you want to go to Tory yourself to try to curse your enemies, though, you'll be out of luck. Stones are no longer there, or rather, they're at the bottom of the ocean beneath a cliff on the island. This is because of the tragic fate of HMS Wasp in 1884, the year before Jack's death. The HMS prefix stands for His Majesty's Ship and means that it was officially a Navy vessel. In practice, it served as a general transport ship for government officials around the coast of Donegal and out to the islands. Sometimes this was a good thing. In 1883, it was responsible for bringing seed potatoes to the island of Innistrohul, which had been struck by blight. But in 1884, it brought a different and much less welcomed cargo to Innistrahul, bailiffs, coming to evict tenant farmers who hadn't paid their rent. And in 19th century Ireland, with ruinous rates set by absentee landlords like Jack, pretty much everyone was behind on their rent. Tory Islanders, for example, hadn't paid any rent since 1878, when the island had been bought by Benjamin St. John Baptist Jewell of Manchester. We don't know what happened on board HMS Wasp in the early hours of the 22nd of September as it approached Tory Island. The senior officers were asleep, and for whatever reason, the less experienced men decided to sail between the island and the mainland, rather than around the outside of the island as usual. The ship's boilers were off, so the ship had no engine power, just sail. Somehow, all these factors combined to cause disaster. The only thing we can say for sure is that at 3:45 a.m. the ship ran aground on the rocks surrounding the island. The ship sank quickly, and in less than half an hour only the mastheads remained above the water. Of the 58 crewmen on board, only 6 survived, climbing the rigging as the ship sank and then struggling ashore. There they were sheltered by the islanders, until they could be picked up 4 days later by the Wasp's sister ship, the HMS Valiant, which took them to Rathmullen on the shores of Lough Swilly. For the next few days, the local priest, Father Michael O'Donnell, supervised the grim business of collecting the bodies as they washed ashore and laying them out to be shipped back to the mainland. This might explain his reaction when the villagers told him that a man named Hegarty was taking credit for the wreck. Hegarty was at the time the King of Tory Island, under the Brehon law we mentioned earlier. He was telling the locals that the HMS Wasp had been coming to evict them from the island, and that he had used the power of the cursing stones to cause the wreck. Now, Father O'Donnell had actually been one of those who had organised the islanders to try to get their rent reduced. But after his work in recovering the bodies, he was enraged by Hegarty's opportunism. So, denouncing the cursing stones as devilish superstition, he took them from their bullens and threw them off the cliffs. In 1903, the Congested Districts Board, who managed the poorer parts of Ireland for the government, bought the island from Benjamin St. John Baptist Jewell. He had never received any rent from the islanders. In 1914, another boat was sunk off the island, the super dreadnought HMS Audacious. It had hit a German mine and was the first battleship the British lost in the war. Unlike the sinking of the Wasp, this was kept a secret for several years. In the meantime, under the land purchase laws introduced in 1905, the local farmers bought their parts of the island from the government. Life there went on. There was an attempt by the Irish government in the 70s and 80s to convince people to move off the island, after a storm cut them off from the mainland, and a relief drop had to be made. But a lot of them still hang on, and a steady stream of tourists helped to keep the island alive. As for Jack's castle in the Glen, it and his estates became the property of the government in the 1970s and are now a tourist attraction. How that happened, and the events in the castle in between, are a story for another day. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.